I'm Austinlugo.
I'm Andrew Harp.
This is With Nothing to Say.
Let's talk about The Murderer Lives at 21.
Before we get started today, just a quick shout out to our friends at AG Chat. They are a great podcast, a little bit shorter than ours, only about 15 to 20 minutes. They talk about TVs, movies, and all things entertainment. If you guys do have the time, please go give a listen. They are a really great podcast. So thank you to AJ, shout out. So being the month of October, we decided this whole month we would have themed films that are horror, murder, thriller, sort of that type of thing. Now, this week was my week to pick a movie I had seen, and I knew that would be a bit of a challenge because, Andrew, you've seen hundreds, if not thousands, of horror films. That's kind of your niche.
Yeah. Maybe, at least compared to you, maybe a little bit more. Yeah.
You've seen so many. You see one like every day. You're constantly watching horror movies.
I love them. They're good.
I would describe Andrew as a horror expert of sorts. He's really seen them all. But this week I got to choose the movie. And I chose this film because, one, obviously you hadn't seen it, and Henry George Clouzot is one of my favorite filmmakers. I think, honestly, if his films were in English, he'd probably be bigger than Alfred Hitchcock. The film we watched today, The Assassin Lives at 21.
In French, it's Les Assassins habitent à 21. And in English, it's The Murderer Lives at number 21.
It's pretty early Henry George Clouzot, so he kind of has a very similar trajectory to Alfred Hitchcock in the sense that his early films were very comedic. And although it'd been a long time since I'd seen this film, I'd forgot how funny the film is, because it really is a comedy in a lot of ways.
Yeah, it's definitely like a detective comedy kind of mystery thing. I've heard of Cousteau, but I've never seen his stuff before. So yeah, it's a good opportunity to watch his first film. I believe this is his first film, 1942. Very early, very old film. And yeah, I guess we could just get into it. The movie starts out with a bum, and he's in a bar, and he's spinning racks. He's got a big stack. He's drinking a lot. People come in and they're like, "What's going on here?" And they kind of like talking to each other, and they're like, "He won the lottery. He won like a lot of money, and he's like, spending a lot on money and stuff like that." You know, it's funny, it's humorous. He leaves, and you get what is my favorite part of the movie is that part where he's like walking around. That part of the movie is is probably the most horror-y part of the movie, I would say. It's probably like proto-slasher kind of stuff, like Halloween, John Carpenter kind of stuff. Almost like walking around, like he's almost like kind of walking in a circle. The way that he filmed too, he's kind of walking in a circle, and he's like approaching people. He's trying to get a taxi. He can't get it. Also earlier, they mention of this murderer named Mr. Durand. I think they mentioned in the bar before he leaves.
Yeah.
They're like, "Oh, don't get killed by Mr. Durand." And he's like, "Fine." And he's walking around and stuff, and it's, dark and damp. He keeps walking. And then, of course, it does the thing where it's like the camera is the perspective of the killer, because then it kind of, that scene ends with like kind of like the camera almost like zooming in as if a person is running up to him, and he gets stabbed and killed. His money taken, and then they leave a card that says like Mr. I forget what it says, something Mr. Durand, or like something in French, like Mr. Durand was here or some shit like that.
It's Monsieur Durand, I think.
Yeah, Monsieur. Yeah. And that's kind of what sets it off. He's like a crazy killer who's going around killing people and taking their money, and it kind of sets it off.
And I love that opening murder, I guess you'd call it, because it's all one shot, right? It's just a oneer. Henry George Clouzot is kind of famous for being a very dynamic filmmaker, especially for the 40s. He likes to move the camera a lot. It's very smooth. They probably built tracks like for a dolly for that shot, but it's just like so beautiful, and it's just moving around. And I think what's interesting about that shot is it doesn't like originally feel like a POV. It kind of just feels like you're following him around, but then it kind of converts into a POV, which is really fun, especially for a film from the 1940s. I don't know if I've seen a film earlier than that kind of uses that same technique. Not that it hadn't been done before, but this is definitely early in the POV area. Not like today where every movie's got a POV in it. But it is very impressive scene.
Well, have you seen like a Halloween? Yeah.
No, not yet.
Halloween has a lot of those kinds of shots where you have like these one long shots of POV shots where you're kind of slowly moving around a house or moving around a hall from the perspective of typically the killer. So yeah, this is definitely very proto slasher, very proto horror film. And Halloween
Yeah.
just like uses that technique quite a bit. Very well, of course, very, to perfection. But yeah, it's interesting to see it this early on.
Yeah. The next scene is where we're introduced to the police commissioner and inspector in the police department, correct?
Yeah, that seems pretty funny.
So we see like this big time commissioner or somebody, and he's talking to, one of his underlings, and he's like, look, like the media's on us, they're pissed, and Sir Durant, he's murdering all of these people, not cool, we need to do something about it. So you have 2 weeks to figure this out. And then the camera like turns, and then as it turns, they do like a clever cut. So it looks like they're just like turning around. And then it goes to like another underling, and he's like, you have 1 week to figure this out. And it goes to another underling, and it's like, you have a week, right? 4 days to figure this out.
That scene is it's humorous. It's good. And then I think like you get to our main character, Inspector Vens.
Vince, yeah.
And they go to his desk and he has like a note that says like, I know I have 1 week to do like to get the killer or whatever. And he's kind of the main detective Sherlock Holmesian character of the movie. And I think shortly after we're introduced to his wife.
This fledgling actor who supposedly is too good. The reason she didn't get into her last film was because she was too good of a singer, and she's trying to get this job at, I don't know, acting somewhere. And the casting director, whoever it is like, no. What we need is a name. Right? We need a big name, like, oh, this Monsieur Durant. I would hire this guy in a minute. She's like, oh, I'll get my name in the paper. And that's when her husband walks in, and he's like, how the hell are you going to do that? And she's like, oh, I'll just arrest this Monsieur Durant guy.
It's always funny when she sings because she's like pretty good, but it's like annoying. You know what I mean? Like they're both on the case or whatever. And I think like a little bit later, she gets like caught by the police because she's like riding her bike around like late at night. And the police are like, what are you doing? She's like, I'm trying to find Durand or whatever. And like she like gets arrested. Yeah, because like you said, she wants to be famous by catching the guy. But, Wins is on it or whatever. And I think shortly after that, they find the guy who Wins talks to later, who has all the cards.
It's the scene right after she gets arrested, because there's like a police officer walking around, and there's this guy sitting up on like a lamppost. And the officer's like, hey, what are you doing here? And he's like, oh, I'm waiting for the bus. It's very clear that he's taunting the police officer. He kind of takes some jabs at the police officer, which the police in this film, I enjoy how incompetent they are, like outside of Inspector Wins. They just have no idea what's going on. But this police officer is all pissed off. So he takes him in, he books him. And when they go to book him, the guy's like, oh, I want to talk to Inspector Wins or Bins or whatever. And of course, Inspector Bins just happens to be right there. And he meets with them, and he's like, hey, it's clear that he's this sort of petty criminal. They've had like a lot of back and forths over the last years or so. He's just kind of like someone he sees all the time, just someone who's constantly in and out of jail, I guess. And so they go into Inspector Vin's office, and the guy's like, I'm gone straight. I'm doing like real work. And he was cleaning boarding houses or something like that, like moving stuff out of a boarding house. And as he's cleaning the boarding house, he goes to the attic. And of course, in the attic is just this giant suitcase or chest of some sort of Monsieur Durant cards. And he's like, look, I don't know who it is, but he lives at this address. And so Spectre like Vin's like, sweet, I'm going to go figure this out.
Yep, he decides I'm going to go there. He lets his wife know, and his wife is like, what are you going to do? Oh, I'm just like going out for a bit, and And she like pushes him and pushes him. They're pretty good together. They're pretty like, funny. That's one of my favorite parts about the movie, by the way, is like the chemistry between everyone. Everyone's pretty on each other. It's pretty good. And he's like, oh, I'm going out investigating or whatever. And he doesn't really specifically say what he's doing or where he's going. And so he arrives at the boarding house. Well, before that, you're introduced to all the boarding house characters, of course.
It reminds me a lot of like the movie Clue, where like they each have their own little unique personalities, and they all have their weird, like strange things. Like one of them's like this failed writer who keeps trying to write books that are just too dense for everybody. There's the guy who supposedly fought in Africa, I guess, or Australia. Is that what? Because they say the bush. Australia, is that Australia?
I think he said Northern Africa.
Okay, it is Africa. Okay. So there's the guy who's supposedly fought in Africa. There's just a bunch of wild and wacky characters who are certainly like over the top. It doesn't feel disingenuous. Like it feels fun and kind of silly. And it's a nice way to sort of create distinct characters so you kind of know who everyone is. And that's when you're introduced, or not introduced, that's when Inspector Venz comes in disguised as a pastor.
Yeah, once again, like I like the cast here. It's pretty good. They're fun. And then, yeah, he arrives as the pastor and he's like, yes, I'm the pastor. And he's very convincing. He like talks to everyone. I like when he's talking to the doctor, the soldier doctor, and he kind of like quizzes him a little bit. And he's clearly like lying about his service, I think, right? That was my impression. It seemed like he was like talking to the
Mhm.
soldier guy and he was asking questions about like, oh, what da da da, where were you? Where were you? What were you doing? Da da da. And like he couldn't answer the questions. So it's like he's lying. I thought that was like a nice detail. It was pretty funny. Yeah, but he's like very convincing and everyone's like very convinced that he's a pastor. And then I think his wife finds that letter, right? Yeah, she like finds the letter that he left to be opened later. And it basically says like, I went to the boarding house to investigate the thing. So she knows where he is. So then it cuts back to him investigating again. And, he's like talking to everyone, kind of getting to know everyone. And I think he does this thing where, he goes into like the different apartments
Yeah.
that he went to the wrong one.
Yeah. That's fun when he goes into all the different apartments because they're all like designed in these very representative of who these kind of different characters are and like how they're kind of put together. I love the part where he goes into the magician's room and he's got all these cool like magic trick thing, just little tricks, and he has all these things that are missing, like a phone without a cord and all these things, which is just fun. I think the magician is probably one of my favorite characters because he's just this over the top, silly, ridiculous showman.
That guy's also like always stealing things from people, right? Like he's always like pickpocketing people, right? So he's always like taking their money and stuff. And that, of course, continues on throughout the film until the very end.
And then after they meet the magician, that's when they sit down to dinner, right?
So the part where he's like going to the different apartments, I think that's capped off with him going into his own room and the doctor soldier guy's like looking through his stuff, which is suspicious. So he's like, that's weird. Okay. Then they have a little dinner. And right before they have dinner, of course, the inspector's wife shows up out of nowhere, which is kind of weird. Like, I don't understand. Like, she like comes out of nowhere. She like does this thing where she like bear, and then she pops up out of nowhere, and they have dinner, and then they cut, and she's like singing to everyone. Was she also pretending to be a customer? We don't really know. It's just like she comes out of nowhere, and everyone's like, "Oh yeah, like she's a great singer." Like it was like kind of random. It didn't really make sense, like how she like. I guess it doesn't really matter or whatever. She just shows up and she's like, "Oh," hey. And then they like, yeah, she sings, and everyone's like, "Wow, that's awesome." And then Wenz is kind of like talking to everyone, and all the characters are kind of talking to each other about Mr. Durand. They're just kind of like all like kind of like accusing each other, kind of sort of.
Especially like the doctor soldier guy is like, oh, well, Monsieur Durand, he's like a folk hero, basically. Weird argument to make. And from the very beginning, he's always like the one that seems obviously the murderer, but you can't tell if like it's supposed to be like a fake out or not because it's like too obvious. So it's kind of hard. Like you go back and forth. Like, is that too easy or is it just like clearly him? And so you go back and forth, you go back and forth. And I believe right after this scene is when the police department gets the phone call, right?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, because then shortly after you get, they all go to bed, and they get like one of my favorite scenes where they're like all in their rooms and stuff, and everybody's kind of like listening to like footsteps and stuff like that. And I think like Wins goes into his wife's room and she doesn't know it's him, so he clobbers him in the head. That part of the movie is so funny because it's like Wins has like built up like this like character, like this very convincing pastor character that everyone is totally convinced by, and his wife just like hits him in the head, and then like the whole thing is ruined. That part of the movie is very, very funny to me. Just like gets decked, and like the whole thing is like over. I like too when the police come, they answer the door and it's the police. It's like, we hear about the murder. It's like, you heard about it already? Yeah, it's upstairs. That's hilarious. And yeah, they see Wenz, and it's revealed that he's the inspector. I think one of the characters like, I'll get some water, and she goes into the door. I think it's the nurse of the blind guy. It was like a blind boxer guy.
Yeah.
And she goes into the room, and it's the rider, I think, has been stabbed in the bathtub. So they're like, oh crap. And so they're all kind of like in their robes and stuff, and the cops are there, and they're all talking to each other. I think the cops initially point their fingers at the doctor guy, right?
Yes, because the blind man has heard someone walking up the steps who has a limp. And so this is kind of like a Sherlock Holmes moment because the police are like, no, it's definitely this guy. But Wins goes, actually. And then he does this thing, which I love, which is he has the doctor walk up the steps. And then he walks up the steps with the cane. And he's like, oh, it was the second one, not the first one, proving that it actually wasn't him. And they're asking around, who like was out, like who was like in the bathroom around this time. And they're asking around. They're looking around, and it turns out one of the men, the nurse, saw him come out of the bathroom like right after she was murdered. And they do this great thing where they're like, okay, Mr. Vince is like, we want you to take off all of your clothes. They like pan. So on the left end of the screen is like a shadow of the man. And then on the right side of the screen is the inspector looking at him. And they make him strip all of his clothes, first his top, then his pants, and then his socks. And that is when it is revealed that his socks are dirty, or not his socks, his feet are dirty. Therefore, he did not take a bath. Therefore, he is the murderer.
I guess how would you tell if his feet were dirty? I guess if they're like covered in
Mud? I don't know.
I guess people didn't bathe as often.
Yeah.
So it's probably just like covered in dust or whatever. But even so, they got him. They got the guy, or did they? They throw him in jail and they're like, all right, that's the guy. He did it. But someone else was killed.
I can't remember which murder this was. Someone dies. Oh, I know. Inspector Vince goes to answer the door. And as he opens the door, a corpse falls on him. And in the corpse's hand is a message from Monsieur Duran saying, basically, I'm still free. And they're like, we didn't get him.
And the cops are like, we knew it. We knew it was the guy, the original guy, doctor guy. And so they grill him for a while. They interrogate him. And then they let out the other guy as well. I think that guy makes dolls, by the way, the guy that got arrested. I was just trying to think what his quirk was. His quirk was that he likes to make dolls. So yeah, they arrest the doctor guy and they are interrogating him. And I think that the inspector's like in. And so I think he goes and does some more investigation. I think he talks to the nurse again, right?
Yes, he goes back to talk to the nurse, and she's like in this seductive,
I think she calls it a negligee, right?
which is like this 1940s, like really fluffy, very, I guess, revealing for the 1940s. I mean, it's pretty revealing. I guess it's sort of revealing. It's revealing enough. And she's kind of this, I don't want to say seductress, that's not really what she is, but she's very forward. And, he's trying to just figure out what was really going on that night. She's like, no, I definitely saw him. And he's like, well, obviously you didn't. And then he like accuses her of being sort of part of conspiracy. She's like, no, I'm not, blah, 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 blah. And I can't remember how that conversation ends.
I think from the conversation, he suspects the magician because I think she reveals that the magician now has a gig after everything that has happened. So he's like working, he's got like a gig again.
Right.
And I think after that scene, you check in with the magician guy and he's about to go on stage or whatever. And I think a journalist shows up, right? And they have a conversation. And then like at the very end, he's like, I don't suspect all of you. I don't suspect you or whatever. And the guy's like, oh, well, you should, which almost like gives it away, the fact that it's him. You're like, oh, it's got to be him, right? It's got to be him, remember? Because it's kind of like, it like zooms in on his face and he looks all evil. And then I think after that, you're back in with the doctor soldier guy. And I think he is like confessing, right? But clearly he's doing it under duress. And then I think you cut back into the magician and he's doing his act, his like disappearing woman act. And he opens up the chest, of course. And it's the guy, the journalist that got stabbed to death. I wonder who that could have been. I wonder who was the guy that got stabbed. I wonder who stabbed him. Maybe the last person that saw him.
And so, of course, after this murderous reveal, the doctor soldier guy is released from prison. But I don't think they ever arrest the magician guy, right?
I don't think so, no.
And Inspector Venz is like, I don't know what to do. I can't figure it out. I don't know who it is. And him and his wife have this conversation, which is kind of just like a fun little thing, just, more just kind of back and forth between them. I think they have a really good, you kind of talk about their chemistry. They have a very loving, but also like realistic relationship. Like it doesn't feel saccharine in any way. Like it feels like two people who genuinely love each other and just, kind of very playful with each other. And that's when they get an invitation at the boarding house to celebrate the fact that they're not murderers.
Yeah, she's been invited to sing. And I think when they get invited, he figures it out, right?
Yes, they're there. She's getting ready because she's one of the performances. She's going to sing. And he's looking at the bill or whatever it's called. And he's like, oh, they're missing the final act. And she goes, what's the final act? And he's like, I'm going to arrest Monsieur Durand. It's like, ah. And so then he walks away. It's clear that he's figured it out. And he's about to go out, presumably to get the police department. Well, first he tries to call them actually, but the phone line is snipped. And he's like, damn, okay, I'll go out and get them myself. And as he walks out, one of the men points a gun to his back and he's like, we're going out.
It's the magician, and he stole the gun from him.
Very clever.
Yeah, we're going outside, and they go for a little walk.
The walk's fun. It's simultaneously funny, but also there's a good amount of buildup because he's walking around, and of course they keep just running into random people, and the inspector keeps trying to he fakes being hurt and all these different things just to get someone to take him away. But of course the magician's conspirators thought ahead, and so they distract the different people that come by, and the magician takes him to this dark alley or something like that. And that is when it's revealed that it's not only the magician that is the murderer, but it's the magician, the soldier, and the guy who builds the dolls. They're all Monsieur Durand.
I know, it's crazy. And they're like, okay, we're going to kill you now. So one of us is going to kill you. Which one do you want? Do you want to be strangled or shot or stabbed with a big sword? And, the inspector, he's smart. Kind of sort of manufactures a fight.
Yeah.
Where he's like, all right, I will be killed by the guy who originally came up with the idea of Durand. And they have a little fight where they reveal that they were schoolboys with each other, and what they would do is that one of them would do something bad and they would get in trouble, but then the other one would do the exact same crime, and then that person will let him go because it's oh, obviously we got the wrong guy. So they're like, maybe if we did the same thing as adults, killing people and taking people's money, that would also work. And so that's what they would do. And they're arguing with each other about who did what and whose idea was it to do this or that. And that seems pretty good. And I think too, at one point his wife is about to sing, right? And then wait a minute, she figures it out too. She realizes that oh, it's Mr. Durand is 3 people, and she calls the police. But that scene where they're all talking to each other, that's a fun scene.
I think my favorite part about that scene is right at the end, because this whole time the inspector is very confident. He's like, I'm gonna get out of this. I'm gonna be fine. They're fighting, and they're like, okay, you know what? We're just all gonna kill you. But then he's like, oh, I have a better idea. You all get arrested. And he points his cane, and just police come from there's just tons of police just come from all directions. And they come in, they try to run away, they're arrested. And Spencer wins, goes up to the magician guy who he bet earlier 10-1 that he would arrest Monsieur Durand. And he asks basically for his reward.
That was it, right? He doesn't get a reward. He was just
yeah.
I think that's it, right? That's the movie.
That's the end of the movie. It just ends right there. It ends very quickly. It's just
yeah, it kind of just doesn't really waste any time.
That's something I love about films from the 20s, 30s, and 40s. Partly because they were shorter, they didn't think people could sit for more than 90 minutes. So there's not a lot of films over 90 minutes, and there's quite a few films that were kind of in that hour range. And because they were so much shorter, they often didn't have these long epilogues, which pisses me off, right? Because a movie will end, and there's another 20 minutes of just everyone, tying up in sweet little knots, and you're like, oh, here's how this person's living their life now, right? I bet you if they made this movie today, after that scene, they'd have another 20 minutes of him going back to the boarding house and seeing how every character at the boarding house is doing now.
Well, you and I saw that movie, it was Knives Out. That movie's kind of like that, that's not a bad movie, but that's a good example of a movie that just kind of is way too invested in all the other extra stuff to where it's I don't know, it becomes kind of underwhelming after a while.
And Knives Out in a lot of ways is sort of just a reinterpretation of this film. It's very similar.
I like this more though.
Yes, I also like this more. It's a tighter film. It's much more interested in the main plot, even though it has all these side characters. They all move the plot forward, and it's willing to just kind of end instead of having this kind of long, drawn out thing. Which Knives Out's not really drawn out, but certainly compared to this.
Yeah, it's a shame though too because I think I watched this on Criterion, the look of the film is a little deteriorated, which kind of sucks. You know what I mean? It's like, I guess this is the best that they had to provide online. You know, it looks good. It sounds good. 1942. It's a very old movie, but it kind of sucks. I wonder if like, you know, they'll restore it or something like that, because, you know, there are plenty of like imperfections you could tell in the film itself. I hope that they're able to preserve it or improve it over time. But it kind of sucks if like this is the only good pressing,
Right.
you know, available for us. So, but yeah, like you said, it's very succinct, and the cast has a very good chemistry. And yeah, all right, Austin.
So Andrew, final thought. Oh, no, I was going to ask you.
I basically just said what I was going to say anyway. You know, good cast, good chemistry. It's funny. It's efficient. It tells a good story. And yeah, I mean, you know, it's real solid. There's not a whole lot to say. It's just a good, you know, mystery detective movie, and I would give it a 7.
I love this film. I'm always impressed and interested in a director's first film, kind of their first foray into the world of film. I think in a lot of ways it's representative of their future career. And if you go and look at Henry George Clouzot's career, although his later films aren't nearly as comedic as this one, there's some like certain traits you can see, like the way he loves to work with camera movements and have these long, fluid shots. And I also believe Henry George Clouzot was pretty young when he made this film. I think he was still in his 20s, which is pretty young for a director, especially back in the 1940s. And like you said, I would love to see a better restoration of this. It's strange because this and Citizen Kane came out in the same year, but you can watch, right, Citizen Kane in like 8K, right? Just like a beautiful restoration.
I think, yeah, Criterion has like a new 4K release of it, right? Yeah, it's like, yeah, you can watch it like as if it was filmed yesterday. It looks that good, probably. Yeah.
But I do think this is probably, and I think Henry George Clouzot himself is one of the most underrated directors of the 40s and 50s and 60s. It's disappointing that, you know, some of his most famous films either kind of went unrecognized, or of course there's a couple famous situations where his films kind of never got off the ground, or they were like stuck in production hell. I think he's genuinely one of the great directors, and this is just further proof that, you know, he's just someone who clearly knows what he's doing. His movies are funny and fluid, and this is just a perfect example of that. And it's also just a film that I could just watch over and over again. And I think part of it's just this weird nostalgia I have for films from the 30s and 40s. I just feel very at ease watching these kind of films in a way that I don't with a lot of modern films. Like I can be, I don't want to say less invested in them than I am in modern films, but in a way that like I can just turn this on and this can just be on. Like I couldn't do that with, you know, a film that's come out in like the last 10 years. Not to say like either of them are better or worse. It's just, I don't know, there's just sort of like easy feeling I have with these sort of films. So that being said, I'm going to rate this film a 9 out of 10, mostly just because it just makes me happy more than anything else. Technically, I think it's great. I think it could be better in some senses. I don't think it's a perfect film by any means, but just this kind of personal relationship I have leads me to that score. All right, y'all. Thank you for listening. You can find me at Austinlugo12.
You can find me on Twitter at ADHarp24.
And you can find this podcast wherever you hear your podcasts. You can also find us on YouTube and Instagram at With Nothing to Say Podcasts. And thank you all for listening, guys.
Thanks, guys.